Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a moral podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 159, Cahiers du Cinema Part 2, Éric Rohmer. And Alex, that is a moral podcast, not a moral podcast, right?
Yeah, although I guess it could be a moral podcast if depending on your perspective. But that's kind of the point. And maybe the most important thing is not whether we are a moral podcast or a moral podcast, but whether or not we live up to our own definitions of
whether or not we
morality.
think we're a moral podcast.
Yeah. We think we're moral, therefore we are moral. But is that correct? I don't know.
That's the worst type of morality.
Yeah. Anyway, we're talking more about the French New Wave and specifically Éric Rohmer. But before we dive into the filmmaker today, I want to talk a little bit more about the context of the French New Wave within the history of France and culture itself. And it should be a pretty familiar story for anybody who's studied early post-World War II culture of any kind, or anybody who's familiar with baby boomer culture. It's essentially what it is. But each week, I would just want to come back to this topic a little bit to add context to it, because more often than not, where we try to add value in addition to the analysis of the films on the show is by adding a little bit of context as to how they were made, why they were made, and so on and so forth. And oftentimes, while a piece of culture should be able to be enjoyed without that context, if you're really studying the greater the greater fabric of culture as a whole and where stuff fits into that and the development of it and the history of it, then a little bit of historical context can be very helpful. So we need to take it back to World War II, as we so often do in this podcast. And history in general. That's where the hinge point for basically the modern era. And after World War II, the French nation was not in a good spot. It was pretty much broken. It had been conquered by the Nazis. And while there were those who in France who resisted with all their might, the famous French resistance, and there was a lot of pride in it, there were also collaborators who kind of either welcomed or complied with the Nazis on their entry to the country, known as the Vichy regime. And France kind of didn't know what to make of that after the war. What's going to be the narrative? Should it be pride in the French resistance or shame of the Vichy regime? And this is a common theme with France. They're not the only country to have this, but it's a common theme overall. I mean, if you look at the French Revolution as well, there's a lot of pride in the early part of the revolution where it's all about expanding personal liberties and tuning down the monarchy. And there's a lot of shame involved in the latter part of the revolution where it gets all head choppy and let's make Napoleon our great empire and dictator, therefore nullifying the entire point of the revolution. So France has kind of done that a lot, and they're going to do it again with their culture as we see today. And maybe more importantly than all of the ideas of French culture itself, was the fact that the economy was just broken. That's going to happen anytime there's a giant war like that. And that economy would be rebuilt in large help from other powers in the West, namely America. And eventually France's economy would spring back and boom in the post-World War II era, but not without some changes to it. Maybe most notably was the fact that the population exploded, very much like it did in other Western countries, as you know, of the American baby boomers. But a lot of those births weren't coming from traditional French families. There was a lot of immigration, and there were a lot of pregnancies and births happening outside of traditional families, essentially out of wedlock, which meant that the primary force that would keep a traditional culture intact, passing it down from one generation of a family to another, wasn't as intact as it otherwise would have been. So the culture itself was primed for a huge shift. In addition, the economic aid from America came with a lot of stipulations. For instance, pre-World War II, American films were mostly banned from France. You couldn't show them there. You couldn't distribute them there outside of like a personal venue. But that changed. in post-World War II. And there was a huge influx of American movies, including this whole backlog of Western movies that had previously gone unwatched. So this is when like Hitchcock films would invade France and become very popular eventually with cinema clubs. In addition, the post-World War II prosperity promoted technologies such as the TV and the car in an affordable manner so that they were basically available to everybody. And those two things, the TV as a form of visual media that would keep you home from the cinema, and the car, a piece of technology that could take you to other luxury activities, such as lounging on the French Riviera, kind of took the floor out from under what was left of the French film industry. It reached its peak in 1956, a full decade after the American film industry reached its peak film going rate in 1946, but it tumbled off a cliff at that point. And film going changed in such a drastic way because the audience changed. Who was left going to the films in the movies were urban, young, better educated, and better economically off than previous audiences were. Essentially, cinema stopped being the entertainment of the masses and became the entertainment of a select few. And that would eventually influence and become the people who would become part of the French New Wave directors. And there is always been, at least to me, and I think to other people too, to a certain extent, a certain whiff of elitism, whether it's bourgeois or intellectualism or something of that nature about French New Wave films. And I think this might explain it. The background of people who grew up watching and making French New Wave films was that of slightly better educated, slightly better economically off, maybe a little more worldly, and that kind of permeates the films as well. And I think that that cultural context is important to understanding the filmmakers and why they made the films the way they did. And I think the locations, especially in Rohmer's films we'll see today, definitely play into that idea. And culture as a whole became what we would call modern or self-aware of itself and its changing identity. And artists at this point in time, and still to this day, started to create with this in mind. Like, you had to kind of consciously decide whether or not you were following a more traditional bent of culture or inventing a new form of culture, as well as kind of like this more general industry that exists to criticize and discuss cultural change at a larger level that still exists today. I mean, the Filmlings is part of it. Cahiers du Cinema is part of it. That has become much more common. I do also want to leave on this last bit, which is that the term Nouvelle Vague, I'm not saying that right, and I'm not trying to because I can't do French. I'm not sure the French can do French.
The French don't care what they do, actually, as long as they pronounce it properly.
But that just means the new wave. And that was originally not a term for the movies, but rather a term coined by the French magazine L'Express, think like The Times here in America, but French. And it wasn't in reference to the films, but rather in a reference to that huge wave of young people post-World War II, aged like 16 to 35, who would become essentially that baby boomer generation. That was kind of the French term for it. And I just want to leave off on one tidbit.
Le boom des enfants.
There you go. But yeah, I want to leave off on this one interesting tidbit. And I think this is important to remember because we talk about a lot of these things and a lot of these cultural discussions as if everyone's having them. But L'Express actually had a survey they did with young people where they were asking them cultural questions. Were they concerned about the course of modern literature? Was it deviating too much from classical literature? Or were they concerned about something else? And most young people responded that they were mostly thinking about getting jobs and starting families and, you know, reading whatever culture appealed to them, mostly detective novels at the time. And I just want to throw that out there because I think it goes to show that while people in the French New Wave were thinking so hard about what film was and could be, they were definitely the minority of people. And even us here on the Filmlings, we definitely fall within this strict like minority of film fans who care a lot about this stuff, but it's not super common. So sometimes you read these books and it makes a lot of these matters sound like they're do or die or life ending circumstances. But it's also important to know that it's kind of like a bit of a fringe interest. Which
but
also
there is still a sense in which those intellectual circles do kind of influence the way that the masses will experience films eventually. Because I mean, as we're talking about, they're the ones that end up making the films. Yeah,
is that because so few people are interested in this, those who are can therefore have an outsized impact on the course of culture as a whole.
They become the taste makers by default.
So many people, so few people are interested in steering the ship that those who still have their hands on the wheel have an outsized impact. And you definitely see that with the French New Wave, I think. But specifically today,
which is why A24 is going to take over Hollywood, because no one else is thinking about where Hollywood should go.
Yeah, no one else is really putting an effort in. It was Marvel for a while, but Marvel's kind of furthering. So it might be A24. I don't know. We'll see. We can only talk about it with certainties in retrospect. And even then, maybe not. But today we're specifically talking about Éric Rohmer, or should I say Jean-Marie Maurice Scherer, or should I say Maurice Jean Scherer, who was born in either Toul or Nantes, France, maybe in 1920. And
Did this guy exist?
This guy, Éric Rohmer. So the first thing we should talk about with him, and unlike Godard, was very private about his personal life. He claims he often says that a lot of his films are super personal, so they're probably the best chance we're going to get at understanding who he is. But he kind of was pretty notorious for giving reporters contradictory information about his birth names, dates, and locations. So there's not that much to talk about when it comes to Éric Rohmer's personal life. Mostly we're going to focus on his professional life.
After a quick Wikipedia, it looks like and this is important regarding the films that we're going to be talking about today, he looks like the only one of the Cahiers directors that we're talking about who was only married to one person.
Yeah, he was only married once. He's also notably the oldest of them.
Right.
And he's
so
also,
like you asked last time, like who is Godard to the Cahiers? I think of Rohmer as like either the cool uncle or almost, this may not be right because I haven't seen the film yet, but like Robin Williams' character in Dead Poets Society, like the teacher that they all kind of look up to.
I wouldn't say the teacher. We'll get to why, but he's definitely
they definitely had differences, but he was like part of his thing is that he was a teacher. Like that's his original occupation.
Originally he was a teacher, yes. But yeah, he was definitely the most conservative of the group, and that comes into play. As if you guys remember from last episode, we talked about Godard and his politics, and that he was a far left Marxist who promoted revolutions in parts of the world. Like he was far left. And Rohmer wasn't super far right, but he was definitely conservative in the stance of in the idea of a traditionalist.
I have a quote from him where he says, I prefer ideas that are as old as the hills, and unashamedly so, to the flat echo of the turn of the century writing that Europe is wont to take as its inspiration. Which I think can be seen in a lot of the films we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. But we don't know him as Jean-Marie Maurice Scherer. We know him as Éric Rohmer. It was his nom de plume and functionally his name, as far as we're concerned, for most of his life. And he took bits from two of his favorite creators, Erich von Stroheim, who is a famous silent film director in Austria and America, and Sax Rohmer, who was a British author of the Fu Manchu series, whose villain spawned the idea of the Fu Manchu mustache. So that's such a seemingly contradictory thing to me, but I also love it that he picks somebody.
It's like his Reddit name.
Yeah, right. It's like somebody he picked like an artistic director and essentially like a comic book writer.
Right.
Which is such a interesting mashup. But I love that people keep defying those expectations. It's never. I try to explain this to people when I tell them what kind of movies I watch, and that it's all the kinds of movies that there are. Just because you like the artsy movies doesn't mean you don't like the poppy movies too. Like you enjoy them all. I feel like restriction in that matter is short-sighted. But regardless, Éric Rohmer did originally work as a teacher in the town of Clermont-Ferrand, which is the location for My Night at Maud's, at least the majority of My Night at Maud's, before moving to Paris in the 40s to become a freelance journalist and writer. And he also did publish a novel, Les Vacances, in 1946, also known as Elizabeth. But much like Godard, he began attending cinema clubs where he met his other new wave conspirators and co-directors. He participated in the short-lived Gazette du Cinema venture with Godard and Rivette before signing on to the much more successful and well-known Cahiers du Cinema. He was likely the most conservative of the group and had a very different writing style than a lot of the other participators in the French New Wave. Godard and Truffaut were typically much more aggressive and rebellious and very youthful in their writing, whereas Rohmer had a tendency to be a little more reserved, rhetorical, and less assertive in his writing, posing questions to the audience in order to get them to think about the movies that they saw. Starting in 1950, Rohmer began making short films, starting with one titled Journal du Secrétariat, which was shot on a bar. I'm not even going to try, guys. It's not going to go well if I try, so I'm just going to make it goofy. Which was shot.
If we had listeners, we would get hate mail for all this.
We would. French hate mail. French hate mail. Which was shot on a borrowed camera in 16 millimeter. He would continue to collaborate mostly with Godard and Chabrol on more short films. I found it interesting that Godard starred in multiple of Rohmer's short films. He and Chabrol co-wrote 1957's Hitchcock, which was one of the first film books to put the concept of auteur theory to paper, focusing on Hitchcock's biography as well as his work in cinema and how the two related to one another, which is pretty important considering Hitchcock grew up Catholic in a very strict Catholic school that had him thinking quite a bit about right and wrong and false accusations, and also bringing a lot of that Catholic guilt to bear. And that shows a lot in his work. In 1959, Rohmer would direct his first feature, The Sign of Leo. This would be produced by Chabrol's production company, which would eventually go under, but Rohmer thankfully made his own production company, Les Films du Losange, which I thought was lozenge, but maybe it's not.
It might be the same word. I don't know what it means in French.
Yeah, I don't know. But it would be the one that all of his tales would be released under, and I think he still used it up through the end of his career. I don't think he's dead. Starting in 1962, Rohmer began working on
dead.
his. Oh, he died?
He died in 2010.
Oh, 2010.
Age 89. He lived a long life.
89, that's pretty good. I would not be mad about that. 89's darn good. Starting in 1962, Rohmer began work on his most famous film series, Moral Tales, each of which was based on the structure of F.W. Murnau's famous silent film, Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans from 1927, in which a content man is tempted by a second woman before eventually returning to the first. Seriously, if I had a nickel for every director who said they loved F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans and based a movie off of it, I would have like so many nickels. He had previously written the tales as short stories before he decided to adapt them. And in fact, if you get the Criterion DVD collection, you will get the booklet with all the short stories in it as well. And I will say, I really enjoyed reading the short stories before watching the movies, and that might become one of my go-tos with foreign language films, especially for the podcast, is to read the script or whatever work it was based off of first, as long as it's not a full novel, and then to watch the movie. I feel like it helps me follow it a lot better.
This will be a fun turn of tables, because usually I'm the one doing that.
Oh, my, how the turns have tabled. As the new wave progressed from writing to making movies, we talked about this last time, like the 50s, the 40s is when they meet up. The early 50s is when they start writing film criticism. And the 50s as a whole decade is when they start making short films. By the end of the 50s, they're all making feature films, movies. And that's kind of when they become directors.
But Rohmer's one of the last ones to jump into directing.
He is. And then he does it with a vengeance.
Yeah.
He's maybe one of the most consistent film directors out of the group. He's very like orderly with his work, as we'll explain in a second. But Rohmer continued as the new wave progressed from writing to making movies. Rohmer would be one of the few people in the group who continued to like new releases of American movies. Other people in the group, Godard, Truffaut, would start to move away from them and enjoy them less and less, and embrace more radical left-wing ideas and cinema verite ideas, which makes a lot of sense for the 60s and for the people we're talking about, and specifically, like we saw with Godard, who got wonkier and wonkier with his style as he went on. He would
just
eventually
threw everything out the window.
Yeah. Sometimes literally. Rohmer would resign from his position at the magazine in 1963. I've heard some sources describe it as a resignation. I've seen some sources describe it as him being forced out. Sounds like it was a bit of both.
Rohmer actually has, well, I watched an interview with him and the producer of Les Films de Los Anges. Yeah, in terms of him leaving Cahiers, there's an interesting story about how he cites Truffaut as being one of the main instigators of him leaving. And then later they reconnected because he was doing a documentary on some author that Truffaut really liked, so they brought him in and they got to talking. And Rohmer said he wasn't mad about it, because it was like he kind of needed to leave. He needed that kick in the pants to go do other things and not be bogged down with the administration of Cahiers. But then Truffaut actually read the script for My Night at Maud's, which no one would produce, and ended up scrounging up some money to help him produce it. So then they kind of had a reunion over that.
Oh, that's nice. But after his departure from the magazine, he still needed a day job, because much as today, making movies as a director does not make money unless you're making TV. And that's what Rohmer did in the 60s, less so as time would go on, but mostly in the 60s when he was still getting started, and those first three moral tales were coming out that were not as polished as the last three and definitely didn't have the budget of the last three. He was working in television, making mostly shark documentaries, but he would continue his moral tales until they wrap in 1972. And after that, Rohmer started another series of 6 films called Comedies and Proverbs, in which each film was based off of a proverb. That ran from 1980 to 1987. And then after that, and then in the 90s, he made another series of films called The Tales of the Four Seasons from 1990 to 1998, which I need to check out because I've also watched some of Kurosawa's seasonal tales, and I'm curious if there's any correlation. I think they come out around the same time, too, so I'm really curious if there's any correlation there.
Are you Kurosawa?
Kurosawa, yes. Yeah, that's my new Reddit name. In 2007, Rohmer released his final film, The Romance of Astraea and Celadon, and retired. And as Jonathan mentioned, he passed away in 2010, not long after, at the ripe old age of 89. 9, which is pretty darn impressive. But Jonathan, now that I've slaughtered my share of French, it's your turn. What movies are we talking about specifically out of the 6 moral tales today?
Real quick note before moving away from this, because we just talked about his time making TV documentaries, and there's actually at least 1 or 2 of them in some of the Criterion special features. And basically what a lot of those TV programs were conversations. They basically today would be a podcast series where he gets 2 interesting people together to talk about a topic for a long time. And so he said later that those documentaries are what got him interested, or realizing the potential of how interesting it can be to film conversations about deep topics. And so that carries over into the way that he ends up making films. And the films that we're talking about, which are very conversational, starting with My Night at Maud's. So we're hitting 3 of the big moral tales, because we're not covering all 6, but I'm sure a few of the others are going to crop up. But we're going to start with My Night at Maud's from 1969, written by Éric Rohmer, starring Jean-Louis Trintignant, François Fabian, and Marie-Christine Barrault. Cinematography by Nestor Almendros. They're actually all cinematography by Nestor Almendros. He was very important in the work of Éric Rohmer, and apparently was super helpful, because on some of these that had very, very little money, specifically La Collectionneur, I think they said that they basically shot a 2-to-1 ratio of footage to used film, which is insane. It's insane. Basically, he said he turned it over to the editors, and he was very involved in the editing process, but the editors looked at it and they thought that it was a short film based on the amount of footage. But he was just basically Nestor was able to get every shot practically in the first take for almost every one of the shots in that film. So he films all these. And then the second film is Claire's Knee from 1970, starring Jean-Claude Brialim, Aurora Cornu, and Beatrice Roman. And finally, we'll be talking about the last of the moral tales, Love in the Afternoon from 1972, not to be confused with the Billy Wilder film starring Audrey Hepburn and Gary Cooper. But this is very, very different than that film.
Yeah. The American movie actually came out first, which is shocking.
Yeah, in the 50s, I think.
Yeah.
You'd think that he would have picked a different... I mean, he was very much aware of Billy Wilder, so you'd think that he would have picked a different name for the film. Anyway, starring Bernard Verlet, Francois Verlet, and Zuzu. There you go.
It's like Cher. You don't need a last name. You just need Zuzu.
Especially if your name is Zuzu.
Yeah.
But before we move on, let's talk a little bit about the idea of morality, because these are moral tales. And so we can define morality as, in the dictionary, the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. And Rohmer himself talks about the way that he uses morality in these films as being, specifically, what we're going to see is that the films are about the ways that the protagonist, which, as Alex already said, it's about a man kind of choosing between 2 women, the woman he's supposed to be with and the woman who's tempting him away from the woman he's already with or is supposed to be with. And so the films are about the morality that the man sets up for himself and the way that that's challenged in real life situations. And Éric Rohmer said himself that a moralist is someone who is interested in the description of what goes on inside man. He's concerned with states of mind and feelings. So that's what we're going to get a lot of today. Alex, I came across this. Do you know what film it was that kind of kicked off a gear in Éric Rohmer's head to start thinking about films in a moralist way?
Was it Thinking About Films in a Moralist Way, a documentary in American movies?
No, it wasn't. So Éric Rohmer wrote an article in Cahiers du Cinema in 1955 called Rediscovering America. And I'm going to read this quote. He's already established which film it is, but I'm going to let Alex figure it out as we go, because we've talked about it already. And then came the day, this is the quote, And then came the day, in the shape of Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable. The cinema held up to me, under the most favorable lighting, a face without artifice, unpolished but not rough. It spoke to me in a language that was open, yet without a hint of coarseness in its tone. It behaved like the most civilized of creatures, yet without diminishing any of its naturalness. It touched not my schoolboy's heart with its ardor for Guide and Breton, but that innate taste that we French never lose for a moment, beyond all changes of fashion, for the art of the moralist.
Alex. It's Jonathan's favorite movie. It Happened One Night.
It is a great movie. But yeah, it was... I think that there was kind of getting a sourness towards American films, and then for whatever reason, this rerun of It Happened One Night kind of like sparked Rohmer to start thinking about films in a different way, because it's just so kind of raw and fun. But there is a lot of that morality built into It Happened One Night. You have the walls of Jericho. You have this kind of budding romance throughout the whole thing, which I think is really interesting.
It's very much a movie about lines being respected and lines being crossed. Set up by the characters involved. Yeah.
And I think it'll be fun at the end of this episode to talk about other films that we find Rohmer-esque, that are more influenced by Rohmer than ones that influenced him. Because I have a list that I'm sure you have some on the top of your head.
Yeah. I will say, one of the things I read when working on this show was... or that I was very happy I read when I was working on the show, was the idea that they were all built off of Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, because I watched all of them without knowing that. And now knowing that, I feel better about the French people as a whole. Because at first I just thought it was like Rohmer's take on who the French were. And I was like, wow, the French have problems. But knowing it's specifically that setup over and over again, I'm like, okay, it's meant to be this specific setup. I get that.
Yeah, I don't know. I saw an interview where he was saying that he didn't intentionally make it about a guy choosing between two women over and over again, but kind of realized that thread later on. But that interview was when he was pretty old, so I don't know what the truth is.
Yeah, right. But it definitely recurs over and over. And the gist of it is typically that the plot matters a lot less than what the characters think about the decisions they make in the plot and whether they or not they live up to their own standards.
Right.
But with that,
internal states.
Yeah. With that, I think it's time to jump into the films themselves. Jason, take it away.
My Night at Maud's from 1969. Jean-Louis, a Catholic engineer in his early 30s, lives by a strict moral code and immerses himself in mathematics and the philosophy of Blaise Pascal. After spotting the delicate Francoise at Mass, he vows to make her his wife. Although when he spends an unplanned night at the apartment of the bold divorcee Maud, his rigid standards are challenged.
All right, Jonathan, I think... So when you read the short films, this is a distinction we'll have to make with each of these movies. But when you read the short stories, not the short films, the short stories, they all are essentially narrated because you have the inner voice. Well,
that's what stories are, Alex.
Yes, exactly. They all have the protagonist as the narrator of their own story, where they think about their actions and reflect on their actions. But not all of the films have narration as...
I think one of them doesn't.
I think
Claire's Knee is the only one that doesn't have any. Some of them have less than others.
Yeah. I think Suzanne's Career doesn't have any.
No, it definitely does. It ends on... At the end, he looks at her.
Oh, yeah, at the end it does. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was sprinkled in there.
It's mostly absent. But yeah, there's if you read the short stories first, it'd be almost hard to conceive the films without narration because the internal states are so important. But there is some variance into how narrated they are, and that is important. But My Night at Maud's is... To be fair,
Claire's Knee is narrated diegetically.
Yes.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, My Night at Maud's is narrated, which is very important. We have a protagonist who is super conflicted about all of the ideas of like who he has been and who he is, which I find very interesting. He's maybe he's probably the protagonist who's set up to be like the most in a state of change.
Yeah.
Like he's very consciously going from being his past to his future, and he's thinking about who he's going to be in the future versus how he was in the past. So
but it's a conscious confliction too, because he acknowledges that he has an ideal for himself that he doesn't always meet, which is part of, he's kind of accepted that, even though he's still trying to meet his ideal at all times.
Yeah. It's also important to note that this is the final black and white film. If you watch the whole series of 6 films, you'll see the production budget slowly tick up over the course of the movies.
Did you notice the discrepancy here, though? So there's
what?
My Night at Maud's is the third sequentially of the Moral Tales, but it's not the third one that they made, because no one would produce My Night at Maud's, as I mentioned before. So they actually did La Collectionneure first,
really?
Even though it's the 4th film. But
I never noticed that.
I watched them. I was watching them based on the date in Criterion, and then I was like, wait a second, did I mess something up? Because I was supposed to watch My Night at Maud's first. So I actually watched them in the chronological order and not in the Tales order. But but the first 3 are supposed to be in black and white, and My Night at Maud's is supposed to be specifically in black and white because a lot of it takes place, or at least the guy's hometown is in Pascal's hometown, and or where he's living. And that town, apparently a lot of the houses are built with volcanic rock, and so a lot of the houses are black. It's like a town without color. And so Rohmer really wanted to accentuate that with the black and white, and then also using a lot of black and white in the clothes and stuff like that. And I would also say that this film is one of the most, it's one of the more talky of all these talky films. And
it's the most heavily built on a discussion. Like the central
but it's a very black and white morality that's laid out here too.
I was going to say, this is probably the film that presents the clearest idea of what a moral tale is supposed to be. It has the character probably with the strongest sense of self, as conflicted as he is. He really thinks he's probably the most, coming back to that French word moralist, which is a noun which describes somebody who thinks in that way, thinks about the states of being and what should and shouldn't be in a state of being, is probably fits that description the best, is the protagonist of My Night at Maud's. And it kind of becomes like the cornerstone, especially because it's in the center of the whole series for that matter, I think. Yeah. And it also
not to mention we have a Hitchcockian blonde and brunette dichotomy.
Yes. Yep. That's true. That's true. And yeah, it definitely has, they're all talky movies. Éric Rohmer loves his long-winded discussions about relations between men and women and just banalities of life that kind of all play into the central theme. And clearly relate to what the character is going through. But this one probably has the longest one. It's like most of the movie is literally his Night at Maud's, is this discussion. I love the Criterion Blu-ray feature that names every scene. It does break up that into a few scenes, but you're just like on that series of scenes for 90% of the movie. It's crazy how much the movie is that. But it works really well. Now, the interesting thing to me is that when I read it in the short story form and watched it, I was like, wow, this center section here, the literal Night at Maud's, feels the most like a stage play to me because of the way it's set up. And when you read the short story, especially, it literally reads like stage direction at the very beginning when they're describing the setup of the room.
That's interesting. Because that's one of the reasons that no one would produce this, because the producers kept looking at it and saying, this is just a filmed stage play. No one wants to see this, and sending it back. And Rohmer says that was partially his fault, because he, obviously the dialogue is a huge portion of his interest in making films, but he would just leave out a lot of dialogue, even though he was also very Hitchcockian in the way that he would do his storyboarding and planning out ahead of time. What he calls decoupage, and but he wouldn't put that in the script, so there wouldn't be descriptions of shots and like what people are doing and what things are happening, which is very important. So Rohmer is very aware of the fact that his films are somewhat theatrical, but he also is aware that the films are specifically made as films for a reason, and the way that the film medium accentuates the themes are all done very intentionally.
Yeah, and what the other thing I found interesting is that I've read that Rohmer's conception of film was that it was a medium far closer to the classic novel format than it was closer to a theatrical stage play. So
Right.
it's always interesting to me when his films almost read like stage plays in the way that they're contained and built around dialogue and performance. Which, real quick, the performances in Not My Night at Mods are very, very good. You can tell the actors clicked with the material. It worked well. But I think the better way to explain it and look at it versus this is a stage play, why does it look like a stage play, is that Rohmer is the specific way in which Rohmer uses the film medium and why he likes the long conversations he does and the long takes he does and the minimal scene changes that he does. He loves giving you time to think. He's got films about very smart people, and he makes movies for people who he assumes are going to engage with his material in an intelligent way. And he wants to essentially invite the audience to have a night at Mods as well. He wants you to feel like you're almost at the table thinking and reacting to what the other characters are saying and doing. Because while the characters he's portraying are moralist, he also kind of expects the audience to be moralist as well, at least for the duration of the film, and to think about that state of things. And I also think maybe the most important thing here is that it's unavoidable when you do engage with these movies to not have an opinion on the morality of these characters. And it's not going to be concrete because the characters are so complex and conflicted. But it's almost impossible to not have an opinion on these people. Whether it's good or bad, I found myself not really liking most of the characters, but finding them fascinating in all of these movies. But it's ironically a lot of shades of gray, and giving the audience the task of delineating them in a movie that's shot in black and white.
Yeah. And just one point on the narration, because Rohmer talks about the narration too in that interview with his producer. And he said there are two reasons for doing narration. One is that it was somewhat in vogue at the time, and he cites Billy Wilder. He said, Billy Wilder had a film that used narration. We're like, you can say Sunset Boulevard. Like, we know what you're talking about. And then, which I'm assuming it was Sunset Boulevard, especially because Sunset Boulevard also features Erich von Stroheim, of whom he took his name from. And the other reason is because, like you said, it's a way of getting the character's mental state on film in a way that is somewhat inherent to the literary format. And he also cites silent films and the way that silent films would use intertitles not only for dialogue, but also to describe characters' states of minds and states of emotions. And he felt that had been lost through the talkies, where now you're only hearing what characters say and not exactly what they're thinking. And so he's using a lot of that for the way he uses narration in these films. But yeah, what you find as you listen to both the narration and the dialogue of the characters is that a huge point of these films is where the words and the actions of the characters diverge, right? Because so much of it is about some amount of self-justification that is always undermined by what the characters actually end up doing. And as you compare the two, what the character thinks that they're doing and why, and what they're actually doing, and then you are making presumptions on the real why, you start to get a more full understanding of who the characters are. But it means that he has no two-dimensional characters in these films. Like, all of these characters have so many layers and so many contradictions that they feel very much like real people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's one of the things that makes them relate so well. Where the rubber hits the road, man. It's one thing to define your own morality, and then you take it up for a spin. And I think one of the reasons My Night at Mods is such a good example of the moral tales is that you constantly see him contradict his own morality every time he decides to stay at Mods, even though he knows, and he sets it out very clearly at the beginning that there's no way, he doesn't see a future for him with Mod, because he doesn't do one night stands, and he doesn't foresee him marrying anyone who isn't Catholic. And so there's nothing for him to do with Mod, but he continues to stay as flirtatious as Mod is being. And every single time he does it, every single time he takes a move closer, he contradicts himself. But also, like, you get why he's doing it as a human person, especially one who's so lonely. Like, you get why he's doing those things. But man, it's again, like, when these movies are at their best, they kind of make you want to scream at the people in the movie, like, get your head together. What are you doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of like cockiness in a lot of the protagonists, where it's like they can see the temptation in front of them, and then they just tell themselves that they're better than that they can overcome it. And so the other interesting thing is that Rohmer's films most of them are ultimately optimistic, but most of them escape by the skin of their teeth. And so there is that element of ultimately overcoming the temptation, but just barely. And in this case, it's actually in spite of himself, because by the time that he succumbs to the temptation, she's done with him. And so she's the one that kind of ruins it for him, or saves him, however you want to look at it.
Yeah. That's a good way to think of it. At the very end, like,
I'm not thinking about the very end. I'm thinking about the one moment where he turns to her in the morning and he's about to give in, and then she's like, "Nope, you're too indecisive. I can't handle you."
Which, honestly, good for you,
because that's the climax. That's the real climax.
Yeah.
But then,
good for you, Mod.
Yeah. So then it gets way more complicated, because we're like, okay, he had a moral slip, and but he ultimately kind of got out of it, sort of. And then we get the second night. So there's two nights, and I think that this film is so well structured, because we have the night at Mods, and then we have the night at the other girls at Francois. Yeah. And they're so completely different. Like, the whole point is for you to play spot the difference, which is everything in the way that they interact. And so you kind of have this interesting archetypal Madonna horror dichotomy. And so you see Maud as being the flirtatious temptress, and then Francois being the kind of perfect Catholic woman of his dreams, who is she's always covered up the whole time, and they're sleeping in separate rooms and all that. But then we learn, she's not the perfect angel that we think that she is. And he has to come to terms with that. She has a
more flawed moral background than Maud does.
Yeah, she does. I mean, and directly in relation to Maud.
Which is just like a very neat plot twist. Like, dovetail your plots when you can. Yeah. And two,
it's really tight.
Perfectly points out that the difference there, and almost makes it feel silly, right? Like, he would rather be with the girl who had an affair with a married man just because she's Catholic, rather than the woman whose husband cheated on her, even though she isn't Catholic. Like the superficiality of the morality in that moment feels real. And but we know to that character it's not, because to him it's a deep central part of who he is. So it can't be contravened. But as the audience, it feels weird.
Yeah, and I feel like the difference is that, you know, with Francois, they're both going in the same direction. Like, they're on the same trajectory in which they both have the same ideal of marriage, and yet they both have fallen short of their own ideal of marriage. Like he said, he's had his own flings and stuff like that in the past. And obviously he doesn't realize until the very, very last minute what it means specifically to Maud. But the point is, they've both had, you know, not lived up to the ideal, but they both have the same ideal. And so that's why he can't be with Maud, because she does not have the same ideal. So it's not a good long-term trajectory. But I think that what the big takeaway is that his night at Maud's, in which is kind of, as far as the story is concerned, his last big moral slip up or whatever, is what gives him the compassion to accept Francois at the end.
Yeah, it's interesting that he has to, he almost chooses for Francois' sake to present himself as morally dirtied, in a sense.
Right.
Because instead of saying that nothing happened,
her,
he just says that was my last fling. Mm-hmm. And that is essentially to make, he does that to make Francois feel more okay about everything, to put himself on that level, even though he did meet his own moral brief, which is fascinating. And also, in the moment, totally understandable, which is so weird. And that's one of the things about the moral tales, is that everything everyone does is so contradictory, but also you get it. Like, you get what they do. I'm also looking at the outline right now and see that Claire's knee is next. So I want to say real quick that not everything everyone does is totally understandable. Some of it's just freaking weird. But in my night at Maud's, that
we're not even
moment,
talking about La Collectionneur.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that one. That one's weird.
That is the standout oddball.
That one had the people in it who I just did not like the most. Like, everyone in that in The Collector, that's what I believe it translates to, and it's like the only one still in French, and I don't know why, is insanely spiteful, so spiteful and kind of hateful towards each other, and it just is weird and distancing, as fascinating as it is to watch them interact.
Yeah. So for each of the moral tales, I kind of boiled them down, because they're basically, each one of them is a variation on a cage match between a virtue and a vice, or a handful of virtues and vices, right? And so my summary of my night at Maud's is something like, temptation begets compassion to spite self-righteousness, because he's well on the track to thinking himself high and mighty for overcoming his moral flaws. But again, that temptation is what gives him the compassion to accept the moral flaws of his wife, even though his ideal is for everyone to be morally perfect and living up to their own ideals. But he can't hold that with his wife, because he doesn't live up to it himself. And so that gives him the ability to continue to live with her and to present himself as worse than he is for her sake. Yeah. Although I would say that it's not completely inaccurate for him to say that Maud was his last fling, because he did have that intention of compromising. It was
decidedly an emotional fling, even though nothing physical technically took place. Like, it definitely crosses that line. But I think, which is what
he compromised himself either way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of, it's even revealing that he doesn't really consider it to be his last fling. He just says it is, because then in his mind, flings can't be purely emotional. Or even though he said he can't have a one night stand because there's no emotional no emotional component, but he effectively has an emotional one night stand without the physical component. But yeah, it's essentially built off a series of what if he just contradicts everything he says. Which is fascinating. And heck, even the author they talk about, Pascal, they talk about how he changes his opinions and contradicts himself in his own work over the course of his life. And if you read him in this book, it sounds like he thinks one thing, but if you read this other book by him, it sounds like a different thing.
And then the way that Jean-Louis is changing his mind about Pascal all the time. He's like, well, yeah, I used to admire him, and now I'm rereading him, and I don't know. And one last thing I want to say about My Night at Maud's that I think is relevant to all of these is, and also relevant to the style of the conversational style, is that something really interesting comes through all these films, which is an element of Rohmer showing this intimacy that is inherent in confidentism, if that's a word. But this idea that Jean-Louis feels so comfortable with Maud because they communicate on the same intellectual plane, if not exactly the same moral plane. But he ends up confiding a lot in her. And a lot of these films, there's this element of the man taking a female confidant, and that kind of bearing of his inner soul is part of what gives him a physical draw in addition to an emotional draw to her. And so there's this interesting danger in being too free and revealing with your inner self to someone else, because that's part of this. It's not separate from the physical attraction of these temptation situations.
Yeah, no. Never move to Clermont-Ferrand. That's all I'm saying.
Or France, apparently.
Don't move to an Éric Rohmer movie. You'll be smart but miserable. Maybe there's no more accurate theme for the Six Moral Tales than if you want to be miserable, overthink everything and be really intelligent.
They don't all end up miserable. Like I said, they have a more optimistic outcome most of the time than than a lot of other similar types of films that would end up with a very nihilistic ending.
Yeah.
We've talked about films like that before, but these, they usually end up with some glimmer of moral victory.
They always end up returning to the first woman.
Yeah. Claire's knee is a little more complicated though. So
there is I was saving this originally for the end, but before we get to Claire's knee, because I feel like the location of Claire's knee, it's a pretty darn good example of this concept. But these films all are incredibly bourgeois. And I mean that in like the traditional sense of like comfortably middle class, like you don't have to worry about money. And in the what that means in like the post World War II world is that you can afford to go to fancy locations and have a nice vacation or go visit a lake. None of the people in these movies, with a few very specific exceptions, are really worried about money or jobs. And even in the earlier films where the characters are a little more poor, they're like students, but students who are studying to become like a lawyer or a pharmacist, like a job that will pay them good money. So they're upwardly mobile at the very least. But with that idea of like these bourgeois comforts also comes the idea that you're freed enough from the day-to-day grind of needing to work to survive that you have the time and space in your mind to be a moralist. If you're a subsistent farmer, or if you're working every day in a factory and hoping you can keep the lights on, you probably don't have the time to have these deep moral conundrums. You're just trying to eat enough to not die.
That feels reductionist to me. I mean, no matter what stage of life you're in, you're not exempt from the temptation to covet your neighbor's wife, you know?
Well, I'm not saying you don't actually face the moral conundrums. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the way that the people in these films shape almost their whole identity around intellectually tackling these conundrums. Like take a look at like La Collectionneuse, where the guy's like whole drive is to like morally do as little as possible for most of the movie.
He's explicitly a dandy. That's that's a pretty specific situation.
Yeah. Or even the way in My Night at Mods, like this guy clearly doesn't have to worry about money. He's been around all these places, and now he's essentially bored with his work and just has time to think about this. And he's very consciously like, now I guess it's time for a wife, but morally, which wife should I get? Like there's a distinct, what I'm trying to get at is that there's a distinct lack of tangible, like, existential struggle, and more of like an identity struggle. Yeah. And like the ability to have enough time to cope with to struggle with one's identity is distinctly a kind of like bourgeois thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm saying it distinctly shows that you don't have, there's other things that you're clearly not worrying about. And
maybe one way to put it is, if you're bourgeois enough to have the luxury to self-justify all of your moral failings.
Yeah.
It's something like that.
Way to put it. Yeah. You can morally, if you have enough time to think through all of your actions and have a moral accounting for them, then you're definitely living it up a little.
Because otherwise you have your moral failings and then you feel guilt, which is a natural consequence of that, and not always a bad thing. Yeah.
A lot of what happens in these movies can be considered characters trying to escape their own guilt. And part of it too is just
culpability or something.
Yeah. And part of it too is Rohmer's style, which, aside from being long takes of long conversations, tends to involve one or more beautiful young people in a exotic or nice looking location.
Yeah.
I think like Suzanne's career might be like the one exception to that, but except for towards the end, because the house the character the jerk friend has in the
I don't know what was going on in Suzanne's career with their living situations.
Yeah, because you know what, with Suzanne's career, when I read it, I expected like a more sumptuous house. Like it sounded like his friend Guimond, I think, had like a really nice house. And then you watch the movie, and I think it might have just been a factor of the budget, but you watch the movie and it's not a very nice house. But I think it was intended to be. But I digress. I just wanted to bring that out there because the next one takes place in such a bourgeois location, at a nice mountain lake resort town. So let's move on to there. Jason, take us away.
Claire's Knee from 1970. Why would I tie myself to one woman? Asks Jerome, though he plans to marry a diplomat's daughter by summer's end. He spends his July at a lakeside boarding house, nursing crushes on the 16-year-old Laura, and more tantalizingly, her long-legged blonde older half-sister, Claire. Bearing her knee on a ladder under a blooming cherry tree, Claire unwittingly incites a moral crisis for Jerome.
All right, Alex, Claire's Knee is very interesting. As you stated, very beautiful on a lot of levels. And also one that I would say has one of the less optimistic endings, because the guy just is he ends up being a chronic self-justifier and never learns his lesson. But the audience learns their lesson.
Yeah, no, I don't like the adults in this movie. I don't like them at all.
Yeah.
You got, on the one hand, you've got the main character. What's his name? Is his name Claude? I don't remember.
Most of the characters in these films are their own names. Okay, not this one. The guy's name is Jerome.
Yeah. Oh, so, okay. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. The first 5 movies are all named after a woman who appears in the movie. And then the last one isn't, which I find interesting. But, so Jerome. So Jerome, I'm rooting for him so hard for the first part of the movie until he gets.
You just slowly lose your faith in him entirely.
Yeah. And then I feel like sometimes, based on some of the reviews I read, that she gets a free pass. But his friend, who's a writer, is also terrible.
Okay, I was going to bring this up because this flies way under the radar. Okay. So explain your issue, because I feel like there's an extra level that I caught at the very end. Yeah.
So this woman, whose name I don't remember, but
Aurora, which is the actress's name.
I think it's the actress's name. Okay. Yeah. I thought I noticed that. Okay.
Her character's name is Aurora the novelist. She helps us out with the no narration thing.
Yes, she does. But she is a writer, and she essentially, for the sake of her own writing, maybe just because she's a sicko, I don't know.
I have a different take on why she does this, which I didn't realize until later.
Keeps prodding Claude, or I keep calling him Claude. He's not Claude, he's Jerome. Keeps prodding Jerome on this fictional plot that she has about an older man falling for an underage woman. In like this sneaky way, like that story she tells about him hiding the tennis ball or something like that.
She's doing Inception on him before Christopher Nolan.
she's like pushing him into like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you went and talked to this young woman? Because there's this young woman who is like 16. She clearly has a crush on Jerome, which, by the way, that is normal. It's not weird for a teenager to have a crush on an older adult. That's pretty common. It's just you picking out like what you see and like in an adult partner. Now, what's problematic is when the other person reciprocates it. That's not okay.
Yeah, the responsibility is on the adult to
shut it down
correctly.
Yeah. And honestly, there's a few times where Jerome tries to do that because he's engaged and he's like, actually, I'm going to Sweden to get married. But Aurora keeps freaking cutting him off in conversations and talking about other things. Like, no, you're not going to Sweden. She gives him
this. What she does is she gives him this nice little safety cushion where he can be like, oh, so if I try to kiss her, then it's just a test to see how much she likes me. And I can go back and I can tell her how I felt about the whole thing. But it's all just purely a scientific test.
Yeah, which even if it was a scientific test, that's not okay. Just want to throw that out there. But yeah, Aurora essentially, not that Jerome clearly needs a lot of help by the end and self-justifying, but instigates him, and two, gives him that safety realm within to work of in his own morality to pursue these weird things. First with kissing Laura, and then second with the knee thing.
Not Aurora, Laura.
Yeah, Laura. Sorry.
Oh, that's not confusing at all.
And then second with her stepsisters or ex-stepsisters knee, which is the oddest thing I've ever seen in the world. But
that's the most literary thing I've ever seen in a film. Yeah, honestly.
Yeah, right. Like, oh man, that guy is really into a knee, but he kind of gets like, I don't know, talked into the knee thing. It's weird.
No,
it's very weird.
That's where I feel like Aurora hatched a monster that kind of took on a life of its own, where he has that whole monologue about, now, I'm totally over Laura, but I had an idea, hypothetically, if the character in your story hypothetically had this hypothetical infatuation, with a different girl's knee, then hypothetically that would be really interesting. And what do you think about that?
Yeah. And I'm not, by the way, trying to like say Jerome isn't at fault. Like, he's definitely at fault here. He's a big creep, and I'm just trying to say that Aurora is also a big creep, and they're awful people.
Okay, here's my take on Aurora, which I agree with everything you're saying, but I think that the motivation is revealed at the very end.
You think she likes Jerome?
So I think she's protecting herself because at the very end, we learn that she's also engaged, which she has not told Jerome the entire time. But clearly, they are very comfortable together.
Oh, they're so weirdly touchy-feely. It's upsetting.
May have had and a lot of that in these films, I can't tell if that's just a French thing or if that's...
Dude, same.
Literally don't know. But
France, what's going on with all the kissing? Explain.
So they're very touchy-feely. They're very close friends, maybe have a history together. But he's engaged and everyone knows it. She's engaged and she doesn't tell anyone. And I think she's protecting herself from a fling with Jerome because she knows she'll fall for him if she has the chance. So she throws Jerome off on a wild goose chase to protect her own self before she gets married. That's my take.
I could see that, honestly. That sounds like it definitely sounds like something a Rohmer character would do.
But it's so subtle because you don't learn that she's engaged until the last 2 seconds of the film.
Yeah. No, it's
which
really
I think
weird.
Is intentional.
But why wouldn't she just also tell him, hey, I'm also engaged, so nothing can go on? Does she just really not trust herself that well? In which case, why would you spend time with this person if you don't trust yourself around them and you just want to remain engaged? I don't get these people's actions. It's so upsetting.
But
that's what I was talking about.
What is
earlier
important is the turmoil that she causes within Jerome.
Yes. Yeah. No, there's this one has a lot of really good longing looks in it. Yeah. And it's very much the Alicia Keys song, you're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no. I don't even know if that's Alicia Keys anymore. I just know it used to play at the pool all the time. But so here's what. 1 minute he's cold on the idea, and the next he's like, oh, but what if I do? Oh, but what if I don't? Oh, but what if I do? And that's reflected very well in the way he stares at something or ignores it.
And I think this is important because this is also an aspect of what cinema is, right? And where the role of showing versus telling falls within these films, because they're both very important. Obviously, cinema is about showing, and you want to show more than you tell, but there's also an aspect of the telling that informs the showing, right? There's no way to completely understand how much self-justification is happening in Jerome's head if all we get are his desirous looks at Claire and no thoughts about that. And it's interesting, there's a quote by Marshall McLuhan, who's a media theorist, about who's talking about different media and stuff like that. And he talks about how words, the written word, has a way of, it's a limited form of communication in the sense that you can write paragraphs about what is essentially just a sigh in real life communication. And I think what's so interesting about Rohmer is that he writes the paragraphs and shows the sigh. So you get the look at the knee and you get the pontification about what the look at the knee means, which is deceptive. And what the look at the knee actually means is somewhere between the look and the pontification.
Yeah. And I like that they... And I think because what we're essentially getting at is that this is the only one without any voiceover narration, right?
Well, I feel like that's irrelevant because it essentially, between the conversations between Jerome and Aurora, you get the same effect. It's just on screen.
That's what I'm saying, is that narration on Jerome's part would essentially defeat the purpose, right? What's created in that moment isn't just the moral conflict within Jerome, but our reflection on the moral conflict within Jerome. And if we're getting his feedback instantaneously, then we don't have the tension of oh, what did he think? What did he not think? Saying. We have to wait for it to be revealed in the conversation later with Aurora. And the other thing we're seeing is that it's a colder, more calculated response because it's not in the moment. So we're not getting his thoughts in the moment. We're getting them after the fact, after he's had time to cook up his own self-justification.
Yeah. And there is an element of, again, I think the element of the confidant makes a difference too, because Aurora becomes the confidant, which is also why I think it's important if you think about the film with this view that Aurora is protecting herself, because there's that confidant draw between them. And the way that you justify yourself to another person is very different than the way you justify yourself to yourself. So, yeah, I do think that there is an interesting difference between, between a conversational narration and a non-diegetic narration.
Yeah. Unlike the lack of any non-diegetic music.
Right. Except for, was it this? No, I think it was La Collectionnaire. There's, they needed music for the credits or something, and they were gonna write this music piece or whatever, but they were at the Éric Rohmer's producer's house, and he had this drum hanging on the wall, and so Éric was like, "No, we'll just do something like this," and he just started banging on the drum, and then the producer guy went and got a pot and started banging on it, and then they took it to the editors and were like, "We want something kind of like this for the credits," and they're like, "This is great, we're gonna put this in there," and so there's this weird drum banging, pot banging music at the end of La Collectionnaire, which is completely appropriate for that weird, strange film.
Yeah, well, just I mean, when the client says we want something like this, why not just take this and put it in there?
Just do it, because they're going to complain about it if you don't.
Yeah.
But I will say that Rohmer does make a very intentional choice to not use non-diegetic music or score or whatever, because he talks about the fact that is it's a form of manipulation, essentially, and especially in these films where the entire point of watching the film is for the audience to be making judgments on the fly based on their observations of these people's interactions with each other. The more you influence that, the more you're kind of cheating the impact of the film. So you want to give the audience as much freedom to take their interpretations in the direction that they're supposed to go on their own, because then it's a more well-earned satisfaction at the end, rather than like, we've guided you this whole way, and if you thought that, you know, this was a happy moment but we play sad music, then you'll know exactly what to think about it.
Yeah. That's just Rohmer's style. He doesn't want, and also why so many of his films are open-ended. Yeah, it's about an intellectual engagement with the audience.
Yeah,
that's his jam. That's his jamboree. That and a pot and a drum. But yeah, he's not going to give you an answer. The point is that you come up with a response on your own, and more often than not, it's something along the lines of, "How would I act in that situation?" Which effectively turns you into a moralist, which is his goal. That's his agenda.
One last thing about Claire's Denis is in terms of the location, very beautiful, but there's also
gorgeous location.
Two very specific elements to the location that play a almost kind of a literary kind of subtextual role, which is that they wanted to film it at exactly a certain time of year. So there's two important floral events in the film. One is the blooming of the roses at the very beginning when he starts to fall for Laura. And the roses are just in bloom, and they're picking the roses, which is kind of a metaphorical take for, again, Laura is 16, she's just kind of coming into womanhood, etc. So that's a very traditional kind of literary moment. And then the other one is when he becomes obsessed with Claire's Denis, what are they doing? They're picking cherries that have just ripened. And so again, there's this very literary thing, but Rohmer was very specific about filming right when the cherries are blooming, right when the rose bushes were blooming. And there's actually a legend that he went to the location and planted this rose bush at the exact spot that he wanted and timed it out so that it would bloom exactly when he needed it to, which I think is apocryphal, but it's a great story.
Still not as intense as that movie that was shot entirely at sunset.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about
Days of Heaven. You got like 5 minutes of shooting a day. We've done a lot of episodes. That's the point. Anyway, let's move on to Love in the Afternoon from 1972. Jason, take us away.
Love in the Afternoon from 1972. Though happily married to the adoring Helene and expecting a second child with her, the thoroughly bourgeois executive Frederick cannot banish from his mind the attractive Paris woman he sees every day. His flirtations and fantasies remain harmless until the appearance at his office of Chloe, an audacious, unencumbered old flame.
All right, Jonathan, I think this one might be my favorite of the 6. It feels
I agree.
the neatest. It feels the cleanest in its presentation.
I'm gonna say something that contradicts what you have written here.
Go for it.
Or that you had written earlier. I feel like it's the tenderest of the 6.
I don't think that. Or so for clarification, earlier in the notes, before I just changed all of my opinions to a discussion of morals.
Yeah.
In our outline, I had written that I thought this was the cruelest one. And I don't think that those are mutually exclusive, Jonathan. I think they both occur.
Okay. I just feel like you're putting your sympathies in the wrong place.
It's not that I'm sympathetic towards Chloe. I think she's acting
towards
very
the
badly.
Self-declared homewrecker.
Yeah, she's not a good person at all. But I think it wasn't until the second time through the story because I read it and then I watched it. And the second time through the story, it wasn't until the end that I noticed how much. I don't think it was intentional. I think it was an incidental cruelty. That how much our lead character, who I don't remember any of the names, just French dude,
Frederick.
There you go. Had essentially been kind of like unintentionally dragging Chloe along.
No. Maybe it's because I've only watched it once, but I feel like that's completely backwards. She states in the film that her intention is to get him to cheat on his wife. Like, this is her ploy. This is her game that he almost fell for.
Yeah, and he keeps encouraging it, is kind of the thing, by continuing to engage in...
Okay, I'll agree with that. He never actively draws himself out of the game.
Yeah.
Because again, it's that hubris of, I can see the temptation, but I'm better than it.
Yeah. So I concede the point that she is definitely like trying to get him into this because that would be advantageous for her. Like the whole movie, it's
just fun for her. It's not even
she's kind of like sponging off other people, and like you even get the backstory that the reason he knows her is because she like tore the heart out of his friend back in the day.
And then in the middle of the film, she leaves and is like, yeah, I had a fling with this guy and just ditched him for some other dude and then ditched him to come back here.
Yeah. And I think to some extent, I think the protagonist thinks he's kind of like, and not unrightfully so, I will say, morally superior to Chloe. But it's at the point where he continues to get closer and closer to her, and some of their decidedly physically intimate moments that never go anywhere.
Again, is it a French thing? Is it just...
I don't think that one's a French thing. I think they were definitely like in all those instances about to get it on, and then they didn't because he drew back from the edge. And I think the least cruel thing he did in the movie was at the very end where he shuts it down, leaves, and never comes back. That's like, that's the climactic moment. One, it's a really nice climactic moment. It's very Rohmer-esque in how unsaid and unfocused on it is.
But I love in that, since we're already there, we just like went full force into this film. But that the moment that saves him is... I love basically the way that I thought about it in my head is there's a grace in echoes and reflections. So the moment where he sees himself taking his shirt off and he remembers the
reflects
game
on himself,
and he remembers the game, the echo of himself playing with his child, and he's like, "What the heck am I doing?" and just books it out of there. It's such a nice moment. It's everything that is said at the end of My Night at Maud's is just felt in Love in the Afternoon. And I think this is something you notice going through Rohmer's films is it's almost like we talked about with Godard, where he starts by explaining a lot and he ends by showing a lot. There's still a lot of talking in Love in the Afternoon, but it's less moralizing.
Not
it's
as
less
much
preachy.
as Mods. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more people dialogue and less kind of preachy moralizing dialogue, but you feel all the morals underneath it in the actions.
I felt like Mods was the most raw essence of what the moral films was trying to be.
Right. And it's the only one that's explicitly religious too, which helps.
Yeah. I feel like Claire's Knee was probably the best visually shot and maybe the best acted. And then Love in the Afternoon is just the best example overall of what a really good moral tale could be. Like it's decidedly my favorite. It's a culmination of all of the six.
Yeah. It has elements. And actually, to put that on display, did you notice that Rohmer has that moment where all the girls from the other 5 tales come in?
Is that in the moment where he has the talisman?
Yes, where he has his little dream sequence, which I think you noted in here, the only instance of fantasy or dreaming or daydreaming or whatever in any of these films.
Were those all the women from the previous movies? Were they the actresses?
There was Laura and Claire and Maud and I thought
the
Francois.
one was Laura. Yeah, I did notice one because I watched Claire's Knee and Love in the Afternoon on the same day. I was like, that's Laura. I'm pretty sure it's Laura. Did he reuse her?
I think he goes through all of them, which is so nice.
Yeah, he uses all of them. Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing too, as long as we're talking about that now, which is he uses this prologue where the prologue is very long, but he uses a prologue in this film and in La Collectionnaire, but really the prologue is there to establish the character. It's to establish their inner state of being, who they are, what their situation is. And so the prologue ends with this dream sequence where he has this talisman that can let him kind of win the will over any woman. Because he starts by talking about how he's married, he's happily married, and yet he starts to see women differently now. And he's like, I don't even know if I could seduce a woman if I tried or whatever. But sometimes I have this daydream where I have this talisman that lets me, erase the will of other women in order to, win them over or whatever. Except the only one, the girl who played Laura is the only one who just like ditches him, and even in his daydream, which I think is hilarious. But it's showing us that he has this hubris of being, very staunchly devout to his family, but he still has these daydreams about what would happen if he could have control of the will of other women, which is ironic because Chloe ends up being the one who destroys his will. She has the talisman over him ultimately, and he doesn't admit it until he is almost lost the game.
Yeah. Because honestly, it starts off with him kind of in the prologue having just like daytime fantasies, and all relatively innocent, of like alternate timelines for himself, essentially. Yeah, that he never moves on. But everything changes when he finds a woman who very explicitly wants to make that dream a reality to her advantage as well. And then I have a question for you, Jonathan. At the very end of the movie, and keeping in mind, I don't remember if it's mentioned in the film. I know it's mentioned in the book that, and it's not from a trustworthy source either, that Chloe mentions that she spots our main character's wife in Paris one day with another man strolling around. And at the very end of the movie, when he comes home to her, she's crying, and it doesn't seem to be about anything he's done.
Yeah, 100%.
That she had some kind of dalliance as well, or some kind of temptation.
No. Well, okay, here's my take, is that she was literally about to, like, I think she was in the same situation as him. She had been talking with the other professor, and I think he was coming over that day. Or,
oh, you think he was coming over that day?
I think he was coming because he walks in and she seems surprised that it's him that shows up, and she's all like nervous and shook. And then, or she was thinking about going out to him because he's like, is anyone here? Because he starts to, I mean, he doesn't explicitly think that, but he's like, you know, just making sure. And yeah, she says, nope, no one's coming till 5. But yeah, that last moment is the most tender and cathartic moment of all the films, because also there's an interesting maturation throughout the films where we start with the bakery girl. We start with Bakery Girl and Suzanne's career, which both focus around college students. My Night at Maud's is unmarried guy who's about to get married. Claire's Knee and La Collectionneur are both engaged men, and Love in the Afternoon is the only one where the protagonist is actually married already. And so there's this progression of the way that temptation comes to men specifically through these different life stages. And I think Love in the Afternoon, it's like the constancy, the fidelity is what wins out in the end in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, honestly, at the end, the way they were both tempted and came back to each other was kind of sweet and nice. They were like,
they
okay,
just
we sorted
fall sobbing into each other's arms.
They both strayed from the path, but they came back to it before they fell off, and that is notable and honestly fairly realistic to the temptation that exists in actual humans on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. It's such a good combination of all the previous films. And I think one other thing that I felt in Love in the Afternoon is that this is this is going to sound like a double entendre, and it kind of is, but it's not supposed to be, is that I feel like he takes the Hitchcockian idea of there's no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. And he stretches that out into a full film. But you know what I mean? Like, you're just waiting.
Yeah, it is all
for him
anticipation.
To fall.
I mean, that's what he's enjoying at the start of the movie, too, is the anticipation and the thinking of what if. But he's not really actually, he discovers at the end, he's not actually after any bang that isn't his wife.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I think it does. You want to know something else I noticed, Jonathan? Is that turtlenecks are pretty great. And,
oh my gosh, the friggin' 70s just show up.
Well, that's what I was going to say, was that when they were all wearing, like, and I mean everybody's wearing a freaking turtleneck in this movie. It's like a conscious choice. But when they start doing it, one of the first thoughts in my head was that if you, Jonathan, wore a turtleneck, you would look like you were in a 70s band so fast with your beard.
I probably would, yeah.
Like, so quick. Like, you need to start wearing turtlenecks yesterday, my dude.
I just need to grow my hair out a little bit longer to my shoulders.
Yeah, there you go.
With the circle glasses, and I'll be good to go.
Yep, exactly.
That's hilarious. Yeah, but the turtleneck ends up being that kind of the vehicle for his salvation, if you want to put it that way, by the very end. But there's also another moment in insight into his proclivity towards temptation, I suppose. When the casual sales girl sells him the button-down shirt, and because you specifically see 2 instances of him buying a shirt. In one of them, it's a man who's telling him that, yeah, this looks great on you. You should buy it, and he says, nah, it's not really my thing. And then the beautiful woman is like, it might look good on you. Whatever, take it or not. And he's like, all right, I guess I'll take it. So you're getting this, like, he's very influenced by women because it's very much on his mind, but he has to just keep bringing himself back to his home.
Yeah, it's a good culmination of the whole series, right? Because everybody's so influenced or tempted by women.
Yeah. Oh, Alex, I have a question for you, actually, about Love in the Afternoon.
I'm not going to wear a turtleneck. It's not for me.
That's okay. You don't have to wear a turtleneck. Do you think that the effect of Love in the Afternoon is amplified by watching all the previous films? Do you think it gains by it, or do you think it stands alone? Because I feel like the catharsis is stronger having watched all 6.
I think it's good solo, but I think it's richer together.
That's a good word.
Like they're a series for a reason, and having gone through them all, they build on each other very well. Heck, even just having gone through the short stories and writing before watching them. So I knew all 6 stories before I watched The Bakery Girl of Montclair. Like even then, like it made the experience richer because it gives you there. I mean, you don't have to watch each one to understand what happens in the others, but they're all variations on the same or very similar themes. So the morality of them becomes deeper. I think there's like a certain element of like classism that exists in the protagonist's regard for Chloe in Love in the Afternoon. Even though honestly, it seems like it's Chloe's own fault that she's such a screw up. But she's definitely lower class than he is. And I think he feels safer around her and the supposed temptation from her for that reason. That's echoed in The Bakery Girl of Montclair. And the more you start to see those locations, those similarities and the variations on them, I think the richer they get.
Well, that's
the more you get out of the experience.
Yeah, and that's a good comparison too, because when you had originally put that Love in the Afternoon is cruel in kind of the way that he leaves her hanging, it's a very different experience if you have the Bakery Girl in the context, because Bakery Girl is that cruel.
He just stands her up.
It's conquest for the sake of
self-catharsis. He wants to make him feel better after having lost out on the other girl.
Yeah,
By
the way that I put it is
the first girl reappears.
Conquest to spite fate is basically what I put it. But it's so she gets left for no reason, no explanation. So that is much crueler than in Love in the Afternoon, where Chloe does not do much to garner sympathy for herself. And also, I feel like she'll be fine. She's going to find some other dude to ruin later.
Yeah. Chloe will be off doing Chloe things. I'm not really worried about her in that sense. Now, I mean, maybe she could sort her stuff out and figure out what she wants to do and approach something that could build in her life. She is one of those
very frustrating kind of people that I feel like most people know someone like this, where it's like, woe is me, I don't have a job, I can't figure anything out. And then they get a job and lose it like 2 weeks later, like, just wasn't a good fit. No, I think after 6 times, maybe it's not the job.
Yeah. Chloe's a victim of Chloe.
Yeah,
than
exactly.
Anything else. Yeah. But yeah, no, I definitely think it's richer for that. And I think the positive note that Love in the Afternoon ends on is a very nice cathartic moment, not just for the film, but for the whole series.
Yeah, I agree. So as we move on into overall notes, I'm curious because I know that Rohmer did not necessarily translate all the stories exactly to film. I know some of them he kind of just picked up elements or themes here and there and built a film around those. Which ones were the most consistent and which ones were the most divergent between story and film?
Not all. Some of them have some new content in them, I would say, but they're all fairly much dead on. I think there's some added interaction. They're not. At least the versions. Said La Collectionneur
was he picked up the basic idea of the 2 guys and then the elephant vase, but then added a lot more stuff to the film.
Le Collectionneur has some extra conversations in the end of the movie, and there's a few scenes earlier on that are added, like the main character kind of on his own, kind of pursuing his idea of nothing. which makes sense because a lot of that is conveyed in the story by him just thinking in his own head in no location in particular. But you get to kind of see it in the film, if that makes sense, like him pursuing nothing, like when he's kind of just like staring at stuff underwater at the beach earlier on.
That's what the whole film is, him just sitting around doing nothing.
Yeah.
I think he even says
Just
that.
being a dandy.
He says at the beginning, like his goal is to do nothing, and he's trying so hard. He's like working so hard to do nothing. And then his other stoner friend, he's like, he's my guru. If only I could be as empty as my stoner friend.
Yeah, like he's that you miss a lot of that internal narration in that film. Because he talks about his pursuit of nothing. And even at one point, like a lot of it becomes like how he idealizes Haiti, whatever her name is.
Haide.
Yeah, there you go. For being like his ideal of nothing. And that's why he pursues her. But then at the end, he gets all mad in his head because he's like, actually, by pursuing her, I was rejecting my own idea of nothing. So it's back to pursuing nothing for me. He's much more frustrating in the book. He's a weird dude. He's such a strange guy and like so hateable.
Yeah. And then by the end of the film, he just turns into this explicitly manipulative and controlling freak.
Yeah. If anything is missing, it's some of the internal narration that almost becomes scenes in their own regard.
Yeah, but that makes sense.
Or like, for instance, when they introduce Haiti in the film before he sees her in her room with the random dude, like all of that's just like physical description in the book, but they have to turn it into like actual stuff on camera. So you have to do it like that. But I will say for the most part, like the plot points that are hit, which there aren't many actual plot points that are hit in that film or that story, are still exist in the movie. Like it would be maybe from Rohmer's perspective, because he's so nitty gritty into the guts of what goes in and out of the story in the film. It's less consistent, but I think from an outsider's perspective, it's just so dead. It's a pretty direct adaptation. I wouldn't say it was inspired by. It's a direct adaptation.
Okay. Rohmer also says that, which I think we've come to this conclusion on the show before too, which is that the corollary between film and books is not between film and novels, but film and short stories. The best way to adapt literature to film is to take a short story, because a short story can be told in 2 hours way easier than a 300, 400 page book can, which is why we have so many terrible extended films. But short stories are perfect for turning into films because they have just the right amount of content to get across within the amount of time of a film.
Yeah, the short films, the short stories fit very well into the frameworks, and none of the films are that long. I think
the first one's a short film. It's 30 minutes.
Yeah, I think the longest one is either Claire's Knee or My Night at Maud's, but one of those is the longest one, but neither tops an hour 50, I don't think. So they're all fairly contained and short. Some of them sometimes feel long because you're just sitting there watching people talk, but they are fairly interesting. I would not recommend doing more than one or two in a day. Oh my God. I really like the movies, but I also see where some people come from. I believe there's a quote in a movie called Night Moves, where somebody's talking about Éric Rohmer movies and describes them as watching paint dry. And I get what they're saying. I don't agree with it, but I get it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because of Rohmer's style, right? He doesn't do a lot of close-ups. He does very long takes of wide shots. It's always beautiful people and beautiful locations, which is nice. But they're normally just talking about stuff that doesn't seem congruent unless you're really paying attention to the themes. Like the movies only work if you're ingesting them in the way that Rohmer intends for you to ingest them. So if you're here to participate and engage with the moral tale, then it should be a good time. But if that's not your thing, you're not going to have a good time watching these movies. I think they're a very fascinating approach to filmmaking and shockingly minimalist in his style.
Yeah.
Right.
Even once he's out of his financial constraint. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got, I mean, he it's a pretty simple setup, right? Like there's not even like score. It's just whatever's happening on screen is whatever's happening on screen. And it's pretty straightforward most of the time in terms of actual plot. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's probably the simplest and most conservative style out of the French New Wave group. And that makes sense for what we know about Rohmer as a person.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that is consistent with the many other films that he made after these. Although I know that
I've watched some of them, and yes, it is.
Yeah, I know that the tales have kind of a bit of a style themselves. I think he moves away from narration after the tales and doesn't use it as much in his later films.
I've watched the Green Ray, which is the 5th or 6th comedy and proverb entry, and probably one of his more famous movies that isn't inside the tales. Although it's been a minute since I've watched it, and I remember it really feeling like these movies feel, with no narration. A lot of focus on it, on these big wide shots and locations and people interacting and discussing life, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess on that note, do you have what were some of the films that you started thinking about as Rohmer-esque? Because not while I was watching the films, because there's not a lot of one-to-one comparisons, but there's a lot of tonal influence that goes out from this. And I do think it's worth noting that Rohmer himself has stated, in terms of when we're talking about the Cahiers du Cinema guys, we're talking about the politique des auteurs, which is the auteur theory or whatever. Rohmer, who was on the auteur theory side, although I think it's interesting also to note that André Bazin had an article in Cahiers which kind of challenged the auteur theory a little bit and said that some of the Cahiers guys were a little too zealous about it. And so he tempered it a little bit. But Rohmer was definitely, I mean, he was one of the originators of the auteur theory. And yet he's also not one of the guys who would do a lot of cinematic cross-referencing. So he talks about how he's only thinking about his film and how to portray his film when he's making a movie. He's not thinking about how Hitchcock would do it. He's like, I don't even know how Hitchcock would do it. I appreciate Hitchcock, but I have no idea what he would do in my shoes. So I'm just thinking about my own film. So he's not one to be very referential in his stories. But I feel like a lot of films we've talked about on the show give very Éric Rohmer vibes. Yeah,
for sure. It's not one we've talked about on the show, but the one, for I think very obvious reasons, that I immediately think of is just My Dinner with Andre, which is like entirely a conversation at dinner. And they talk a lot about life and other things, but they don't show that. It's just the conversation the whole time.
Interesting. I haven't seen that one, so I can't comment too much on it.
I'm hit and miss with it. I think the reasons that part of it bounces off of me are that is intentional. Like there's definitely, like, your main character is probably hero worshiping Andre a bit too much at certain points, and like idealizing his adventurous life over his own. And I think that part of that is a false desire, or like not as desirable as you would think. So I think because when I listen to Andre's stories, I'm like, you've had a weird life, dude, but I wouldn't want to live it. So I think that's an intentional part of the movie, is that you're supposed to reflect on whether or not you'd find what Andre has to say interesting or admirable in the same way that the protagonist finds what Andre has to say interesting or admirable. And I think the whole thing is one shot, maybe a couple other shots too at the beginning and end, but mostly a oneer, which is wild. Very well acted, but also again, like a bit like watching paint dry. You need to have a lot of internal energy to be ready for that movie.
Yeah.
What about you, Jonathan?
Okay, well, the film that I immediately started thinking of, which kind of made me start going back through my catalog, is Lost in Translation, which is
I could see that.
Very Rohmer-esque. There's a lot of that same kind of emotional temptation dynamic that we discussed when we talked about that film. Brief Encounter, also.
A Brief Encounter, I could see that.
And then
it's because it follows the Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans plot.
Probably. We actually haven't covered Brief Encounter, which I think is hilarious because we brought it up an enormous amount of times.
Episode, but yeah.
A Separation from Iran. And on the subject of Iran, pretty much all Abbas Kiarostami, but specifically Taste of Cherry. And I was thinking, I need to go back and revisit, but I think Charulata follows a lot of that tone too, which was the Sajjad Rai film about I can't remember the whole dynamic, but I remember there was the husband and wife, and the wife was being tempted by this young scholar who was living with them or something like that. A very similar type of thing. There's almost a parody in The Exterminating Angel, which is Louis Buñuel's bourgeois commentary on a bunch of people sitting around talking about nothing for a long time, and they get trapped in this room where they can do nothing but talk to each other about nothing.
Yeah,
those were kind of the main ones that I was thinking. That
I could see some comparisons. I don't think it's an influence, but I could see some comparisons to Ozu films.
Oh yeah, I started thinking that too. Yeah, it's similar, but there's definitely a difference in I don't know if it's just subject matter or there's something distinct about Ozu that I can't quite put them in the same category.
Yeah, no, so I think the distinctive technique that Ozu does, which is the ellipsis, doesn't exist in Rohmer films, but I think the structure of a wide shot and conversation to reveal character and themes exists in Ozu films. And then just the slow pacing, the unrushed pacing kind of fits very well with what Rohmer does. And then, I mean, just good cinematography held in the wide shot. Like the shots are always interesting to look at, even if you might have tired of the conversation a little while ago. Yeah.
And in talking about Rohmer and his relation with the Cahiers group, there was another interesting. So there's a interview in Cahiers du Cinema from the period after Rohmer had left and started making films, but then some of the Cahiers guys did an interview with him and put it in the article. So they were kind of getting some thoughts of his after leaving, some thoughts of his as a director now. So Cahiers was doing the Cahiers treatment to Rohmer. Okay, here. So he talks about how there are kind of two different types of ways of making films. And he says the filmmakers that he admires, they're filmmakers in whose films you're aware of the camera, but that isn't the essential thing. It's the thing that is filmed that has more of an autonomous existence. And then he goes on to say that for some of the other Cahiers directors, cinema is less an ends than a means. While René, Godard, Antonini, you get the sense that the cinema is contemplating itself, that the people filmed exist only inside the film. And I think we touched on this last time when we were talking about Godard, in the fact that Godard is making
intensely meta.
Yeah, Godard is making films about films. He's making films that are aware that they are films, whereas and Rohmer goes on to say that he wishes he could make films where the camera is completely invincible, where you just feel like you are in the scene with these people. He wants these people to feel like real people that you know or could have met on the street or something like that, which I think he does a really good job.
We talked about that with mods, that you feel like you're at the conversation with them, and you're prompted to feel like you're at the conversation with them.
But you also feel like they have a life outside of what you're seeing on screen because they are so multidimensional. They may be the most multidimensional characters I've seen on film, because it's usually difficult to get that many facets of a person and what they think and believe and do on screen, which you can only really do with as much dialogue as Rohmer uses. So he's uniquely positioned to give us those types of characters. Whereas like Godard, his characters sometimes become caricatures or representations of things that we're filming. Like they become splotches of paint in pop art, like we talked about. Yeah.
I mean, Rohmer's, we talked about with the two people with maybe the most diametrically opposed styles first in the series. But yeah, Godard is all about pushing himself and finding new things that work and toying with the means of movies, but maybe missing the ends of movies at times, almost like a form over function and a search for the function of the form. Whereas Rohmer is intentionally simplistic for the very opposite reason. He knows what he wants to get out of cinema. He's not going to push past that by adding in something else. His goal is for invisible filmmaking, like you've said before, which makes sense considering his heroes are from the classical and silent American film era, whose focus was very much on having you forget that you are watching a movie as well.
Yeah. And he has another quote in the same interview that kind of sums it up really well, where he says, "I'm making a distinction between two kinds of cinema, one which takes itself for the object and end, and one which takes the world for its object and means." So Rohmer's films use the world, lived experience, as the subject of the film and the means for delivering an end outside of the film, an end which is a change in the audience, I'm presuming. He doesn't expound on that. But for directors like Godard, the film is the object. It's a film about film, and it's also the end. It's a film to be a film about film. Like, it's all kind of self-contained in this. I'm watching a film that's examining itself and its context in a way that is like, it may have some external results, but that's not really why Godard is making the film. He's making it because he likes to make films and he likes films.
Yeah. I mean, that's what they're all about. And, we talked about this last week, but everybody in the French New Wave kind of started in a similar place, from loving movies and wanting to know what they were about. But after they absorbed that knowledge, they kind of branched out on their own as they got roughed and dirty with the art of making movies itself and finding out what that means for them in practice. And I think this is not the last time we're going to see it this series.
Yeah.
We're going to see it 3 more times, and they're each going to be different. And I will say, finding the distinctions between the French New Wave directors has maybe been the most interesting thing so far between last episode and this episode, and I'm excited to see what we'll find next.
Yeah, I feel like everyone else is going to fall somewhere in the middle, because I think we've hit both of the extremes.
We hit the two ends. Yeah, I will say, when I picked the order for this series, it was a little at random, but you know what? We'll find some meaning in that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But what are we talking about, or who are we talking about next time on the podcast, Jonathan?
Next time, we're going to talk about another one of the most well-known in America directors, which is Francois Truffaut.
The ringleader of the movement.
Yeah, he was outspoken, he was intellectual, he was unabashed cinematic fanboy, and there's so much Truffaut out there in terms of his oeuvre and also his opinions on lots of things that we're going to have fun diving into. But the films that we're covering, we're not talking about 400 Blows, because we did that many moons ago, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes. But we're going to talk about Shoot the Piano Player from 1960, Jules and Jim from 1962, and Day for Night from 1973. Speaking of films about films.
Yes. Yep. Nope. Truffaut's going to do it too. These film boys, what you going to do with them? But that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 486 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
Summaries for this episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Seriously, if I had a nickel for every director who said they loved F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, and based a movie off of it, I would have like so many nickels.
Apparently, we need to do a episode on it.
The thing is, that's like the only Murnau work I know, so it would be interesting to see if his other work is as influential. I bet there's something.
Murnau directed Nosferatu, Alex.
He directed Nosferatu? Okay, we have two things to do for him.
And Faust and The Last Laugh. He has a couple of big ones.
I mean, we could do a whole series on silent film directors. If we had anybody listening, they might write us hate mail. But
this is the best time to do it while no one is still paying attention to the show.
quick while nobody's watching. Let's do a silent movie series.